Good afternoon. Good evening, I should say. I would like to welcome everyone to our second Insights lecture for the fall 2009 season. This evening we have Professor Clay McShane, and he will be speaking on Boston, nearly 400 years of troublemakers, and great history lesson for us this evening. Professor McShane has been with the university for approximately 30 years now. He is a specialist in the United States urban and social history. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in these topics, as well as the history of Boston and the history of technology. He is the editor of an internet-based discussion group called H Urban, and he's also presented numerous of his papers in the United States and overseas as well. He also has written monographs on the automobiles industry and a plethora of other things as well. He has a great repertoire, and at this time I would like to welcome Professor Clay McShane.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I was just trying to figure out before this talk how many students I've taught since I've been at Northeastern. The answer is roughly 8,000. That works out to something approaching $10 million worth of tuition, most of which did not show up in my salary. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have taken a course from me? No. Oh, you took the wrong stuff. What can I say?
You came up with my honors thesis topic.
I wanted to talk today about whatever the title was printed in the title I gave about social and technical innovation in Boston, concentrating on three different stories. One of them about Alice Thomas, who had the chutzpah to open a brothel in Puritan Boston. Not something that is likely to bring you a lot of rewards. One of them is Thomas Edison, who lived in Boston for about a year, did some of his most formative work here, and then left for, promise me you won't boo, New York. And the other is Ray Tomlinson, who more than any other engineer, I would say, is responsible for the internet, although that's part of a big, complicated project that really oversimplifies. First of all, a word about what we mean by innovation. We tend to think about innovation in terms of inventions, and to be sure, an invention is a form of innovation. It involves a kind of cultural change and change in the way that we do things. Now, the process is extremely complex, whether you speak about it in purely technical terms or other terms, because change does not come easily. It requires some form of skilled support. There has to be a market for whatever you were working on. I'm thinking here of Hero of Alexander, who invented a steam engine in the 1st century AD and used it to open and shut temple doors, and conceived of no practical applications for it whatsoever. In most cases, some capital is required, and this is especially true of mechanical inventions. And finally, we all operate in some kind of regulatory or government environment. Let's see what we can do with these things when we talk about the three specific innovations I'm interested in. Alice Thomas was a widow. Like many 17th century widows, she had been given a liquor license by the town. The idea in societies with no welfare mechanisms, very high mortality rates, so there were a lot of widows around, was to reserve many liquor licenses for widows so they would have a means of support. The problem with her tavern is that she was apparently renting the rooms upstairs to prostitutes and was apparently a prostitute herself. Now, Boston had no truck with any kind of sinners in the 17th century. It had been founded as a religious commune. John Winthrop put it, a city on a hill. Their goal was to create a godly community, and they were famous for punishing and exiling not just everyday criminals, but heretics like Anabaptists, Antinomians, Catholics, Quakers. There is a history of executing people in each of these categories. Now, Boston was changing by 1670. It had been founded in 1630. By 1670, the first generation was coming to power in town. And the older Puritans were resentful of the new generation. For one thing, they did not buy into the new theology. Many of them were not being baptized, so they had to develop a new theology to take that into account. Some of the old values were retained. For example, dancing was banned from the city, a sign that the old sensibilities about morality remained. But increasingly, the town's elite turned its attention from religious pursuits to mercantile pursuits. By 1680, there were over 30 Bostonians whose estates were worth over £1,000, an enormous sum for the day. Moreover, they were, as one of the original settlers put it, spending more time making money than in praying. Under those circumstances, Thomas, who went into business in 1672, had certainly picked the right moment, although for her trouble, she was publicly whipped and exiled from the city. However, and this captures the change, she was allowed back in a year later and allowed to go back into business in the area that was then the city's red light district. It shows up on all of the maps as Mount Whoredom. It was located at the outskirts of town, literally where Lewisburg Square is now, if you know Beacon Hill. She reopened her brothel, in exchange for which she made a contribution to the town to build a seawall. Now, notice the trade-off here. A previously unaccepted behavior is being tolerated because of a contribution to the town's material prosperity. As an aside, I might note that that was before the age of property taxes. When the city, well then the town, wanted to build something, they either solicited contributions from its wealthiest cities, a tradition that would last as late as Faneuil Hall, which was a gift to the city from a wealthy merchant, or they would commandeer the labor of every male in the town, usually in times of military crisis when they needed to rebuild fortifications. But in this case, it looks to me like Thomas was making a payment in place of taxes and an indirect kind of bribe. At some level, she must have sensed that there was now a market for her services as Boston became an important trading port full of sailors and other young men, and had a government that was much more willing to tolerate that behavior than it would have been 5 or 6 years earlier. And in fact, that change obviously came at some point between 1872 and 1873. So she took an opportunity, she saw an opportunity, took advantage of it, and had, if not the support of the government, at least the willingness to look the other way. That strikes me as a pretty remarkable story and a pretty remarkable sign of change. Let's leap forward 2 centuries. Yes, 2 centuries. In 1868, Thomas Edison was laid off from his job as a railroad telegrapher in Louisville, Kentucky. He had been experimenting in his office with making storage batteries. He had spilled some sulfuric acid on the floor. It had soaked through, in his office, the acid had soaked through the floor, landed on his boss's desk. This is not a good way to keep your job. So he was fired the next day. Edison, at that point, was beginning his experiments with all kinds of electrical phenomena, especially as they related to the telegraph. And he realized that he had several huge limitations. One of them was educational. He'd only gone to school for 3 months. He was only literate because his mother had taught him at home. He needed laboratory equipment to test his ideas out. And in fact, he also needed a lab that he could use so he would not have to worry about repeating the Louisville incident. He also saw that he would need the support of a number of individuals. He had to learn a whole lot more about what we would call electrical engineering today. He wanted government support for his invention in the form of patents, and he had no idea how to go about getting one of those. Boston was the obvious destination for him. He rented a room in a rooming house, what they call now an SRO, in the South End. At a day, most of you are old enough to remember when the South End was a desperately poor slum. So it was when Edison lived there. The advantage of living in the South End was that he was within walking distance of Boston Public Library. And that meant he could spend a summer at BPL reading all of the latest works in electricity. By the end of the summer, he was what we would call today state-of-the-art in electrical engineering. I have no evidence of direct linkages, but 2 blocks from Boston Public Library was a fledgling school which had opened 3 years previously, MIT, and I would be very surprised if Edison did not have some linkages there also. Boston also was a major manufacturer of machine tools, especially for the textile industry. He had no trouble finding machinists who could make the lab equipment that he needed. In the South End, as in just about any poor neighborhood at any time in our history, there's this kind of live or let live outlook on life. So no one worried about his conducting noxious experiments in his room. By comparison, 10 years later, Alexander Graham Bell's wife threw him out of the house because he was smelling up the kitchen with his chemicals. He wound up renting a room on Cambridge Street, and the rest is, as they say, history. But in any case, Edison did not last in Boston. It had the patent lawyers he wanted, it had the support services that he wanted. He eventually moved to New Jersey. Why? Well, Newark or Menlo Park, which is near Newark, offered cheaper rents. He could also attract more finance capital from New York. One of the things he'd worked on in Boston was a stock market ticker, which obviously had revolutionary implications for Wall Street. I'm struck by the fact that although it was a technology that was invented for the telegraph, if you watch the business news on television, you get the stock market ticket on the bottom of the screen as though it were still a piece of paper being printed from a telegraph machine. So that Edison flew to New Jersey for essentially the same reason that Babe Ruth did. That's where the money was. And, well, a whole slew of 19th century Bostonians. Mark Twain is another good example of that. So that he moved on. Now, Ray Tomlinson, the third example, is in many ways a measure of the way that we innovate has changed. Tomlinson grew up in small-town New York, just as Edison had grown up in small-town Ohio. He went to RPI, came to Boston, as so many people do, to go to school. He picked up a master's degree from MIT, then went to work for the famous engineering firm, Bolt, Beranek, and Newman. I guess they call themselves BB&N these days, although they've been through 3 or 4 corporate mergers, and like everything else in America these days, I'm not sure who owns what anymore. But in any case, he worked for them. He would spend most of his working life there. Now, what becomes interesting with him is that the federal government decided in the early 70s that they wanted an electronic network that would link the various defense research labs scattered around the United States. If possible, they wanted to avoid the telephone system because it funneled all the messages into one point and then out again. If that point was destroyed, the whole system would crash. Instead, they wanted a system that could send a message from here to here instead of like this or through a hub like this. Perhaps this way, perhaps that way. It didn't make any difference at the speed at which electrons travel. Distance is not a huge problem. So the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, an acronym, put out a request for proposals to build such a system, which involved not only new hardware, but essentially it was a software system. There was, at that time, no such a thing as a computer science. That field literally had not yet been invented. BB&N for reasons that are not altogether clear to me, and I suspect won't be clear until historians can get into their archives 50 or 100 years down the road, it may just have been a matter of, there's some money there, let's go after it. That's my cynical side speaking. In any case, they took the money, and as part of a consortium that included MIT, both Beranek and Newman was famous for its close ties with the MIT community and a number of other universities, and I guess what you'd have to call electrical engineering firms, worked on putting together this new thing that would come to be known as the Internet. And it would start off as something called ARPANET, which linked the defense bases. Tomlinson was the one who worked out the system for allowing individuals to send mail back and forth. He didn't think email messaging was such a big deal, and indeed it was not part of the original deal. When he first tried it out, his colleague Jerry Birchbile said to him, "Don't tell anyone, this is not what we're supposed to be working on." So that's a kind of invention by serendipity. The World Wide Web would be invented the same way, by the way. It was essentially a physicist fooling around in his part-time while working at a think tank in Europe. Now, what Tomlinson is probably best remembered for is he was the first one to use that @ symbol that we use in our email. Now, what's quite striking about that is that's semiotics, not engineering. It's a matter of coming up with an appropriate symbol that will suit the purpose. He might as well have used the thing we use for a pound key on a phone or a star on a phone instead of @, but he just struck on @. I don't know why. He didn't either. He can't remember what the first message he sent was. What he said was, it wasn't important, so I didn't remember it. That's the kind of comment, by the way, that drives historians crazy. So that is where the first emails came from. Now, think about that story for a moment. There's some very interesting things about this. First of all, the research was commissioned. All right? We're not talking here about an isolated entrepreneur like Thomas or Edison looking for possibilities and sensing an occasion. The Internet arrived because it was a forced technology forced by the government at the height of the Cold War. So that is different. Tomlinson also is not an isolated individual in the sense that Edison and Thomas were. He was part of a corporate bureaucracy. That bureaucracy was part of a huge industrial, educational, and governmental, I suppose I could say military, network, and he was part of a large bureaucracy, I guess you would have to call them, of people working on it. And yet a bureaucracy, of course, that was flexible enough to let him spin the elements that he did off on that. To me, one of the striking things about his story, and it's in contrast to the others, and also I think it's a measure of some of the economic change we've seen in 20th century and 21st century America is the fact that Tomlinson, as far as I can tell, never went entrepreneurial. He did his work as a corporate employee primarily and for the benefit of that corporation. That is a very different style of innovation than what we saw earlier. And of course, he had plenty of government support. In fact, his salary, indirectly at least, was paid for by the government.